He was alone on a dirt road, wagon near empty, when a starving native boy limped from the scrub brush. Silas had one biscuit left and handed it over without a word. The boy vanished into the trees, but by dawn, 300 warriors stood in the road ahead of him. Why? This is his story. If stories like this move you, please hit that like button so it reaches more people. Subscribe to Quiet Rancher Stories for more real tales of respect, kindness, and unexpected consequences. Silas Boone was a man who lived like the old fence posts on his land, weathered, standing firm, and mostly ignored. He was 42, though the sun and quiet years had etched lines that made him seem older. His ranch was a small stretch of dusty earth tucked away from town, just enough for a dozen head of cattle and a ramshackle cabin. Silas liked it that way. The fewer faces he saw, the less trouble seemed to find him. His only constant companion was Old Blue, a mutt whose fur was the color of fading denim, who usually just slept by the porch. He avoided the dusty main street of Harmony whenever he could help it. The chatter of town seemed to cling to him, like burrs to a horse's tail. People there had opinions about everything, and Silas found most of them weren't worth the breath it took to speak them. He had seen enough of the world's true ugliness during his time in the Indian Wars. That was a past he kept locked away, tighter than his grain store. He never spoke of the skirmishes, the screams, or the smoke that used to curl up from burned camps. Most folks just knew he'd been in the fight, and left it at that. What Silas carried inside wasn't a constant ache, but more like a stone in his gut, a quiet weight. He followed his own compass, an unspoken code about what was right and what simply wasn't. He'd never cheat a man, even if that man had cheated him. He'd never let an animal suffer needlessly. He tried to be fair, even when the world wasn't. His days were a rhythm of chores, mending fences, tending to the cattle, chopping wood for the long cold nights. He ate plain food, slept hard, and often stared out at the wide-open land, wondering if a man could ever truly outrun his own shadow. The silence of his ranch suited him, a quiet kind of peace. The sun was a hammer on the back of his neck, driving the last miles home from Harmony. Silas's wagon rattled, mostly empty except for a sack of flour and a few nails. He'd sold off a couple of calves, picked up what he needed, and was ready to be back in the quiet of his own land. His stomach had been rumbling for hours, a low, persistent growl. He'd spent his last few coins on supplies, and the cheapest whiskey, no biscuits to spare. Just the dust and the endless stretch of road winding back towards his small, lonely ranch. He wasn't thinking much, just letting his horse carry him, when a flicker of movement caught his eye. It was a boy, no older than 10, maybe less. He was limping out of the scrub brush near the creek bed, looking like a scarecrow in torn clothes. His face was too thin, his eyes too big for it. He stopped at the edge of the road, not quite stepping into Silas's path, but not moving away either. The boy just stood there, watching the wagon, silent. Silas pulled back on the reins. The horse snorted, kicking up a little puff of dust. Silas reached into his saddlebag without a word. There it was, one last biscuit, hard and flat, left over from breakfast. He pulled out his canteen too, the leather cool against his palm. He held them out. The boy's eyes flicked from the biscuit to the canteen, then back to Silas's face. He didn't reach for them right away. Then slowly, the boy took a step forward. He reached out a trembling hand, snatched the biscuit, then the canteen. He gave a quick, almost imperceptible nod. No words. He just turned and vanished back into the trees, quick as a shadow. Silas watched the spot where he'd been for a long moment, then shrugged, a little sigh escaping him. He clicked the reins, and the wagon creaked forward, leaving the empty road behind. Silas rose before the sun, as he always did. The air was crisp, holding the last remnants of night's chill. He saddled his horse, grabbed his rifle, and headed out for the east pasture. Sometimes a stray cow would wander too far, or a fence post would need bracing. He rode over the familiar ridge, the same one he rode over every morning. The sky in the east was just beginning to lighten, painting the horizon in soft oranges and purples. Then he stopped. His hand tightened on the reins. His horse sensed it too, shifting nervously beneath him. They were there, not one or two, but hundreds. 300 mounted native warriors spread out across the trail ahead of him, forming a silent, still line. Their horses were bunched close, their faces unriddable in the dim pre-dawn light. They weren't moving, they weren't making a sound, just watching him. It felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting for the ground to give way. Silas held his breath. He figured this was it, the end of the road. He'd seen enough of these encounters in his youth to know how fast they could go bad. He reached for his rifle, then hesitated. What would be the point? This many men, this quiet, meant something. His finger twitched near the trigger guard, but he left the weapon in its sheath. Then, The line parted. Slowly, the front riders moved their horses aside, opening a narrow path. A single elder rode forward, his face etched with age, his eyes dark and steady. He stopped a few yards from Silas, still silent. The elder reached inside his buckskin shirt and pulled out a carved wooden medallion. It looked old, smooth from years of handling. He held it out. Silas, still confused, took it. The wood felt warm in his palm. The elder simply looked at him for a long moment, nodded, then turned his horse. The path remained open. Silas, still feeling the medallion's weight, gave a short nod back, then rode through the gap, leaving the silent warriors behind him. Word about Silas Boone travelled faster than a prairie fire. It caught the wind and blew into harmony, twisting and turning with each telling. Boone rode through a war party and came out alive. That was the core of it. But people added their own flourishes. Some said he'd made a pact, others that he was a traitor, selling secrets for his life. Silas heard the whispers in the general store, the sudden silences when he walked into the saloon. It clung to him like dust, making him feel dirtier than he was. A few days later, a group of townsmen came to his ranch. Old Man Hemmings was there, along with the blacksmith, a couple of cattle ranchers. They didn't draw their guns, but their hands were never far from their holsters. Silas, Hemmings started, his voice too loud and too friendly, heard a tale. Say you got through some Indian folk on the ridge. Must have been quite a fright. Silas stood on his porch, Old Blue dozing at his feet. It was a sight. They let you pass, did they? The blacksmith stepped forward. Didn't hurt a hair on your head. Folks are saying you must have traded them something. Land, maybe. Or worse, information about our patrols. Silas looked each man in the eye. He didn't like being questioned, especially not by men who had never seen the kind of silence he'd ridden through. They spared me for a kindness. That's all there was to it. He didn't offer details, because the full story wasn't something they'd understand, and he didn't feel like explaining. It was simple enough. A biscuit. A canteen. Their eyes narrowed. Hemmings scoffed. A kindness. That's all? You expect us to believe that, Boone? Silas just looked at him, gave a slight shrug. The men left, grumbling, their suspicions deepening like cracks in dry earth. From that day on, Silas became a pariah, a man they looked at sideways, a man who might be one of them, or might be something else entirely. The next week, Silas started noticing her, a young native woman. She wasn't bold, didn't try to approach the cabin. She just appeared, sometimes at the edge of his northern fence line, sometimes near the creek that marked his western boundary. She'd sit still, sometimes for hours, watching his land, or watching him, though she never stared directly. She moved like a shadow, easily disappearing into the tall grass or behind a cluster of pines. He never saw her come or go, just that she was there, then she wasn't. She never spoke. He never tried to speak to her. What would he say? Her presence was a question he couldn't answer. It wasn't threatening. Not in the way the townsmen's glares felt, but it wasn't comfortable either. It was a constant, quiet observation. At night, the air began to feel different. A low, rhythmic drumming started in the hills, faint at first, then growing a little louder with each passing night. It wasn't war drums, not the frantic beat he remembered from his youth. This was slower, deeper, like a heartbeat. The sound made the hair on his arms prickle. He'd stare out into the darkness from his porch, seeing nothing but the wide, empty plains under the stars, but feeling a presence all the same. The air felt charged, as if something was waiting, just beyond his sight. His sleep grew restless. He started having dreams again. Old ones. He saw fire. Not just sparks, but roaring flames licking at the night sky. He heard the thunder of hooves, not of cattle, but of many horses running hard, and smoke, thick and choking, filled his lungs. He'd wake up, gasping, the taste of ash in his mouth. He couldn't shake the feeling. He wondered if this was some kind of test. Or maybe, he thought, a judgment was coming. One of Silas's prize cows, a young heifer, lay in the far pasture. She was bloated, groaning, clearly dying. He knelt beside her, his hand resting on her heaving flank. He knew what it was. Something she'd eaten. Something bad. He'd ridden into Harmony that morning, tried to get the vet. "That cow of yours, Boone," the vet had said, looking at the floor. "Seems I'm busy all week. Got a lot of sick stock." It wasn't true. Silas knew. The town was closing ranks. He returned to the heifer, feeling the familiar weight of helplessness. He prepared himself to do what had to be done, to put the animal out of its misery. He left her for a bit, needing to gather his tools and steady his nerves. When he came back at dawn, the young native woman was kneeling beside the cow. Her back was to him. She moved with a slow, deliberate grace. He saw her hands, quick and gentle, pressing small bundles of dried herbs along the heifer's flank, just above where it bulged. She hummed a low, soft tune that sounded like wind through dry reeds. Silas stood still, watching. The cow, though still breathing heavily, seemed calmer. The woman finished, stood up, and then melted back into the morning mist before he could even take a full breath. The heifer was still sick, but by midday she was standing. By morning she was grazing slowly, a little weak but alive. It was a miracle. Silas went to the fence line where he'd seen the woman before. He waited. When she finally appeared, hours later, he simply nodded. "Thank you," he said, the words feeling clumsy on his tongue. She just looked at him, her dark eyes unreadable, then gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod of her own. She turned and walked away, disappearing again. He knew the townsfolk would find out, and he knew what they'd say. This act of kindness, this silent help, would only make things worse for him in Harmony. Silas went to the general store the next day for coffee. He pushed open the creaking door, and the chatter inside died. Men who had been talking loudly about the price of corn suddenly became very interested in the worn planks of the floor. He picked up his coffee, paid the owner, who barely met his eye, and left. It was like walking through cold molasses. Later, the sheriff caught him outside. Sheriff Brody was a big man, usually fair, but his face was tight. "Silas," he said, his voice low. "Folk are talking about that cow of yours, and that Indian woman. They think you're consorting. That's a serious accusation." Silas just stared at him. "My cow was dying. She helped it. Doesn't matter what happened, Silas. What matters is what folks believe." The sheriff paused, adjusting his hat. "Old man Miller's boy, Billy? They caught him drawing symbols in school. Indian symbols. He said he saw them at your place." Silas felt a cold anger building. "I don't know anything about that." That night, Silas was sitting by his fire, reading a worn book, when a shot rang out. It wasn't aimed at the cabin, not directly. It hit the side of his barn with a loud crack, splintering a plank. The sound echoed across the silent plains. Old Blue sprang up, barking fiercely, a deep, rumbling growl in his chest. Silas pulled his rifle from the rack over the fireplace. He didn't go outside. He knew it was a warning, the kind of warning that usually came before something worse. He spent the rest of the night boarding up his windows, nailing planks across them, making sure they were solid. He slept with his rifle next to him, just like he used to in the war, his finger resting lightly on the cold metal. The quiet of his ranch had turned into a waiting. The bullet hole in his barn felt like a direct hit to his quiet life. Silas found himself, late one afternoon, pulling an old, dust-covered wooden box from the back of his closet. It was heavy, smelled faintly of old leather and forgotten things. He set it on his kitchen table, pushed aside his half-eaten supper, and slowly lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in yellowed cloth, were the remnants of another life. Metal buttons, a tarnished brass buckle, a few grim-looking medals, their ribbons faded, maps with roots drawn in shaky ink, and beneath it all, a cavalry sabre, its blade dull with time, but still carrying the weight of what it had seen. He picked up a medal, a small silver star. He'd earned it under Captain Elias Vance, a man known for his scorched earth raids. Vance was efficient. He'd burn food stores, destroy winter camps, force the tribes to move. Silas remembered one morning, the sun barely up, chasing a small group of women and children through the brush. They were moving fast, terrified, their small figures scrambling over rocks, their cries like birds. He'd been told they were hostiles. He'd been told it was war. He remembered the smell of smoke, the ash on his uniform. He remembered seeing a boy, small and quick, disappear into a thicket, his eyes wide and dark with fear. His hand tightened on the saber hilt. He looked at the tarnished metal, seeing not just the reflection of his own tired face, but the ghost of a younger, harder man. The boy he'd fed, the one on the road, had been small, limping. He could have been that boy, or one like him. Silas had participated in the destruction of their homes, had chased their children into the wilderness, had helped drive them to desperation, and yet they had shown him mercy. They had given him aid. The guilt, a quiet, familiar companion, swelled in his chest. His isolation, already deep, now felt complete. He was stuck between a past he couldn't outrun and a present that refused to understand. One evening, as the last light bled from the sky, Silas saw it. A thin pillar of smoke rising from the western ridge, the same place the warriors had stood weeks ago. It was a signal. He considered ignoring it, but something pulled him. He saddled his horse and rode out, moving cautiously, his rifle resting in his lap. The air was still, quiet. The only sound the soft thud of his horse's hooves. He reached the ridge and dismounted. The elder was there, just as before, but this time with only a small group of maybe 5 or 6 men. They were sitting by a small, smokeless fire, the kind that burns hot but clean. They didn't stand when he approached. They didn't speak. They just looked at him, their faces impassive in the fading light. The elder pointed to a spot on the ground near the fire. There, laid out on a clean piece of hide, were gifts. A woven blanket, thick and soft, dyed in earth tones. Small bundles of dried herbs, their scent clean and sharp, and 3 carved items, a small smooth stone shaped like a bird, a piece of polished wood resembling a bear, and a small intricate carving of what looked like a family. They were offerings. The elder, his eyes holding a deep, ancient wisdom, then began to gesture. He swept his hand toward the hills, then toward the darkening sky. Then he tapped his own chest, then pointed toward Silas's heart. It wasn't a threat, it was a wordless message, a benediction, a recognition of the spirit, of the land, and of a shared humanity. Silas felt a lump in his throat. He reached out and touched the blanket, then the herbs. This was not the war he knew. This was something else entirely, something quiet, profound. He finally felt seen, not as an enemy, but as a man. The crackle started small, a hungry whisper in the night. Then the flames took hold. Silas woke to the blare of the town bell, ringing frantic and hard. He grabbed his rifle and ran to the porch. Smoke, thick and black, billowed into the sky from the direction of Harmony. It was the church. Half of its wooden frame was already engulfed, orange light licking at the steeple, the sound of collapsing timbers echoing through the night. By dawn the fire was out, but the church was a charred ruin. The townsfolk gathered, their faces grim, their eyes red from smoke and tears, and then the anger started. Shouts, "It's the Indians! They did this!" And then, predictably, their eyes turned to Silas. "He's with them! He let them in!" Sheriff Brody, his face streaked with soot, walked right up to Silas's porch. "Silas, we need to search your ranch. We need to know what you're hiding." Silas stood firm, his hand on the doorframe. "There's nothing to hide here. You'll find nothing but my home." "We'll find something, Boone. You've been consorting. You've let them onto your land. We know they've been here." The sheriff's voice hardened. "If you don't let us in, we'll come back, and we'll bring the whole damn town with us." Silas looked out at the smouldering smoke still rising from Harmony. He saw the angry faces, the fear in their eyes. He knew what they wanted, a scapegoat. He backed away from the door, his jaw tight. He spent the rest of the day nailing every window shut, barricading the doors with heavy beams. He hauled water barrels closer to the house. He sharpened his axe. He was tired, but the old instincts were back. He was preparing for an attack, forced once again into a position he had tried so hard to escape. The banging on his door came just after midnight. Hard, desperate blows. Silas grabbed his rifle, pushing aside the heavy board he'd set against the door. It was Miller, the rancher, his face pale and contorted. "Silas, Billy, my boy Billy's gone." He wandered off. "He's out there. The cold, he won't last the night." Miller was shivering, clutching his shoulders. No blame this time, just raw fear. Silas didn't waste words. He pulled on his boots, grabbed his thickest coat, and the woven blanket the elder had given him. "Where'd he go?" "The hills. He likes to play near the old cedar," said he was looking for a lost rabbit. Miller's voice cracked. Silas rode out, the cold biting at his exposed skin. The moon was a sliver, offering little light. He rode not just by sight, but by instinct, by the strange sense of direction the elder's blanket seemed to give him. He felt drawn toward the western ridge, the same ground the warriors had covered. He called Billy's name, his voice swallowed by the vast, empty night. He found the boy huddled under the roots of a gnarled cedar, near frozen, his small body barely moving. He was curled into a ball, trying to hold on to what little warmth he had. Silas dismounted, scooped up the boy's limp form, wrapped him in the warm blanket, and held him close. Billy felt like a bag of bones. He rode back, the boy held tight against his chest, urging his horse through the darkness. He rode into Harmony, just as the first hint of dawn touched the sky. Miller rushed forward, pulling his son from Silas's arms, sobbing with relief. But then Silas heard the whispers again, carried on the cold morning air. He must have known where the boy was because he helped take him. The suspicion, it seemed, was like a disease. It didn't care about a child's life. The sheriff arrived at Silas's ranch the next morning. Not alone. He had 10 armed men with him, their faces grim, their rifles loaded. They spread out, surrounding the cabin. Silas watched them from his window, the early morning light catching the dust motes in the air. He was tired, bone-deep tired of the accusations, the fear, the constant suspicion. He just wanted it to end. He unbarred the door slowly, stepping out onto the porch. "Sheriff," he said, his voice quiet, calm, "you want the truth? Come see." He didn't raise his rifle. He didn't argue. He just turned and walked toward his small smokehouse. A squat wooden building set a short distance from the cabin. The men exchanged glances, then followed, their boots crunching on the gravel path. Inside, the smokehouse was dark, cool, smelling faintly of cured meat and dry wood. There were no hidden weapons, no secret messages etched into the walls, no signs of anything sinister. Just the quiet, ordinary space. On a small, rough-hewn table, Silas had laid out the gifts, the soft, woven blanket the elder had given him, the bundles of dried herbs, their earthy scent now distinct, the small, carved stone bird, the wooden bear, the intricate family totem. He pointed to them, then reached into his pocket and pulled out his old war medals. He laid them on the table too, next to the gifts. "I once rode with men who burned their homes," Silas said, his voice low, steady, cutting through the silence. He didn't look at the men, but at the objects on the table, the proof of two colliding worlds. "I chased their children into the brush. I destroyed their way of life." He paused, then looked up at the sheriff, at the armed men. Their faces were impassive, but he saw something flicker in their eyes. "And after all that, they chose to show me mercy. They chose to help me. That's why I ride through their lines. That's why they tend my dying cow. That's why a child was found." He picked up the medallion the elder had given him and held it out. "I once destroyed their homes. They chose to show me mercy." The silence among the men was heavier than any accusation, thicker than any smoke. Their rifles seemed to droop a little. The next dawn, Harmony woke to a sight that stopped breath in throats and froze hands on coffee cups. Riders. Not just a handful, but hundreds. 300 warriors, once again gathered on the western ridge. But this time, they weren't in the pre-dawn mist. They were in full view, silhouetted against the rising sun, their horses still, their forms clear against the brightening sky. A collective gasp went through the town. Windows slammed shut. Rifles were grabbed. People huddled in their homes, bracing for the attack they were sure would come. But no attack came. The warriors remained still, a formidable, silent wall. Then slowly the line began to shift. The riders parted, just as they had for Silas on the road. And from their midst, the elder rode forward. He was alone, his face calm, his gaze sweeping over the terrified town. Then, a small figure emerged from behind him. It was the boy, the one Silas had given the biscuit 2 weeks ago. He was no longer limping, no longer in rags. He was cleaned, dressed in ceremonial colors, looking strong and steady. The elder and the boy rode slowly, deliberately, toward the charred remains of the church. The townspeople watched, their fear turning into a bewildered, uncertain quiet. The elder dismounted. The boy stepped forward. He walked to the ruins of the church, to the very spot where the cornerstone would have been. And there, with quiet dignity, he placed something on the scorched earth. It was a new cornerstone, smooth grey stone, perfectly cut, etched into its surface. Not in one language, but in 2. The symbols of the native people, and beneath them, the familiar English script, a silent offering, a silent message. The sight of the new cornerstone etched in 2 languages left the town divided. Some whispered about a trick, a warning. Others, though, felt something shift inside them. The elder and the boy remained by the church for a time, not speaking, just standing. Then slowly, tentatively, a few of the town women, their faces still pale, approached the elder. They asked about the herbs the native woman used, about how she healed the cow. The elder answered in slow, patient gestures, his hands showing them the way the plants grew. A rancher, bolder than the rest, approached and asked about horse training, seeing the fine, strong mounts the warriors rode. Little by little, conversations began. Awkward at first, like trying to pick up spilled water. But they started. Silas, still wary, found himself sitting on the steps near the church ruins, next to the elder and the boy. He wasn't saying much, just listening, watching the strange new dance between the 2 peoples. He felt a quiet weight settle over him, different from the old guilt. He wasn't forgiven by either side, not entirely. The townsfolk still looked at him with a mix of suspicion and grudging respect. The native people, while accepting him, still held a quiet distance, a memory of past wrongs. But he was respected. He was a bridge, a man who had walked between 2 worlds and carried a message. The tension didn't vanish. It was still there, a hum under the surface, but the solid wall between them had cracked. Maybe, he thought, that was enough. Maybe a crack was all you needed for light to get through. Months later, the land around Harmony felt different. A new road had been built, winding through the ridge, connecting the valley to the western territories. It was wider, smoother, a sign of changing times. Silas still lived quiet, his life a steady rhythm of chores and solitude. He was older now, the lines on his face deeper, but the restless tension in his shoulders had eased. He wasn't alone, not truly. He had found a kind of peace that had nothing to do with avoiding people, and everything to do with understanding his place in the vast quiet land. The boy, no longer so small, now a lean teenager, returned each season. He never knocked, never spoke, just appeared. He'd leave carved gifts on Silas's porch. A smooth river stone etched with a leaping deer. A piece of wood carved into the shape of a hawk, its wings spread wide. Small tokens of a silent, enduring connection. One brisk autumn morning, Silas stepped onto his porch and saw a small wooden box. It wasn't a gift he recognized from the boy's usual carvings. He opened it slowly. Inside, wrapped carefully in a clean piece of white cloth, was a single biscuit. Hard and flat, just like the one he'd given away on that long-ago dusty road. There was no note, no message, just the biscuit. A memory. A full circle. Silas picked it up, held its weight in his hand. He sat on the porch, his eyes on the far horizon, where the land stretched out endless and free. He took a bite, chewing slowly, the plain, dry taste filling his mouth. His eyes welled up, not with sorrow, but with something else entirely, a deep, quiet understanding. The wind moved through the tall grass, rustling softly, carrying the echoes of a distant past, and the promise of a quiet, peaceful future. He finally understood what that moment, that simple act of kindness, truly meant.